Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be chatting through something that is relatively casual. It's kind of an extension of a video I did quite a while back, which was two publishers from readers, where we went into a topic about what we would like to see from publishers. And I do think what we're going to talk about today is a very small section of that conversation, so it's going to be pretty hyper-focused, and that particular topic would be series continuations. I do want to note that I am going to include the idea of sequels into this conversation, as when I posted something recently over on my Instagram and my community tab, it was clear from the community tab post that when I referenced continuation series, that some people took that to mean simply a continuation book within a series. And so I do think these two topics are related, and I want to address both things. The sort of origin for this topic happens to be a book that I recently picked up, which would be Air by Sabaa Tahir. I can't really comment on the quality of that book or anything like that, and it's not going to show up in a new fantasy releases likely for a very long time, as this book, despite the fact that it doesn't really make clear in its synopsis, it is a part of the same world as Sabaa Tahir's An Ember in the Ashes. I was quite bummed out because I have read the first 3 of the 4 books in An Ember in the Ashes, and not that I need to give a whole backstory about this, but it is relevant to why this topic came up and what is going to be a tiny bit of a rant for me. I had read the first 3 books, and I didn't get around to the 4th book, mainly because many of you know that in 2020, life became very hectic for many of us, including myself, and a lot of my reading, especially if I was in the middle of a series, it just sort of got really disrupted, and I really didn't have the time to try and reread the series at that point. Many of you know I was my father's caretaker, and I was just trying to pick up what I could when I could, and that was very sporadic. So I didn't feel it was fair to, when I did eventually get the 4th book in that series, I didn't think it would be fair from a reviewer angle to read the 4th book knowing full well that I had forgotten a lot of the details of the series, and that I don't feel that that 4th book would have had the same impact as it would if I had been keeping up with the series fairly consistently. So my plan has been for a very long time to do a reread of the first 3 books and then finally finish that 4th installment. And the 4th installment, if it's not clear, that's the end of the series. It's a quartet. I have been stating this actually a lot recently to my husband, so when I brought this topic up to him, he's like, no, that's the series you've been telling me that you're going to reread, and I was like, I know. And where I'm going with all this is to say, I checked with Air if it said anywhere in its synopsis that it was within the same world, because you will typically see some kind of language that indicates, I actually shouldn't say typically, because while this is anecdotal, after this experience, I sort of looked into it a little bit further, and I was like, I feel like a lot of times we're not clear about when things are within the same world. But regardless, I was trying to see if there was some kind of phrase like, within Sabaa Tahir's breathtaking world of An Ember in the Ashes comes a new series. You see that kind of stuff from time to time. And I was expecting to see something similar, and because I didn't, I thought, okay, so this is going to be removed. Even if it's somewhat in the same world, there are no indications within the synopsis that this is going to be closely related to An Ember in the Ashes. Maybe even if it's related to it, it's exploring a different area and totally new characters. And based off the names of the characters in the synopsis, it really did seem like if it's in the same world, it is going to follow different characters. And then I started this particular book, and the characters from the first series are not only mentioned, but pretty much what happens with them in the conclusion of their arcs is mentioned. And I was like, no, now I know what happens to these characters. And I was kind of bummed out about it. And so I kind of didn't want that same thing to happen to other people. So I did put on my Instagram stories. I actually messaged a couple of my friends about it too. I mentioned, hey, just a heads up, this is within the same world and it does reference some things from the original series. So just want to give that information in case it's helpful to you. And then that led me to wonder, do people feel like continuations should be more upfront about the fact that they are within the same world as another series that already exists so that this doesn't happen? I think a couple of really good examples of series that reference original series, so the continuation makes reference to the original, would be something like Red Rising. There is a continuation series, but it's actually labeled as Red Rising Book 4. And then you'll see with Mistborn Era 2, which a lot of us refer to it as that online, but it doesn't say Era 2 necessarily in parentheses on Goodreads, for example. It'll say Mistborn Book 4 as the Alloy of Law, because there's the original trilogy, which would be, of course, as a trilogy would tell you, it's 3 books. Alloy of Law would be the 4th, even though it's the first in the second era. What's interesting to me about Mistborn is that second era takes place 300 years later, so yes, it makes reference to the characters from the original, but it's not like you're looking at Fae, where you might expect to see some of the same people, or elves, where they live these really, really long lives. The characters, many of them are human, and that you're kind of like, okay, this is 300 years after the original. I'm probably going to be spoiled, so maybe I should read the original first. And again, the indication that it's Mistborn 4 also clues you in that it's within the same world. However, something like Age of Madness, which I absolutely love, but I am going to kind of a little bit point a finger. I'm trying to nicely not be upset, but I'm going to a little bit point a finger. I'm not upset about Age of Madness, just I don't understand why they can't include this information. But Age of Madness is very related to First Law in that there are characters from the First Law trilogy that are not main characters, but they're relatively connected to the main characters, and the amount of time that's passed is not very long. However, Age of Madness, the series, is just Age of Madness Book 1, which I don't mind. I actually think even in the Mistborn example, and I'll even say with the Red Rising example, I think that there's enough of a conclusion to the original series that it would make sense to me if they didn't want to label it as, in the example of First Law, I wouldn't expect them to say First Law Book 4, because we concluded the story and the arcs, and often I would say also the themes for all of these. We've concluded those by the ends of their original series, and this is sort of like a new chapter within that world, but not necessarily a continuation of these characters and their plot lines. So I understand why we might not always label it, but I almost think a simple remedy would be like Age of Madness Book 1, and then slash, like, I know this sounds like a lot of text that would appear on Goodreads, but if it was Age of Madness Book 1, and then it said, like, World of First Law, to at least give people the clue that this is within the same world, and if they know that, they might then decide for themselves, oh, okay, so I might need to look online and ask on Reddit or something, or a friend who's read this series. I might need to double check with them, like, oh, hey, it says it's in the same world. Am I going to be spoiled for anything? I think that there are certain series where it especially, though, doesn't make sense to have there be too much of a connection, even though they are within the same world. So the Grishaverse, which I like that it's called that overall by readers, it would be kind of nice if it said the name of the series and then Grishaverse, but I digress. So we have the original Grisha trilogy, then you have Six of Crows. Not only do you follow completely different characters, but you're looking at a completely different section of a setting. It's not within the same city or anything like that. So I understand that that distinction is already there, and you also are going to get the tiniest reference about events from Grisha, but interestingly, the reference is kind of giving you incorrect spoilers, I'll say, intentionally so, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you don't know what I'm referring to. But in that instance, I think it especially would be weird if Six of Crows Book 1 was listed as Grisha Book 4, because it's not a continuation of the Grisha story, it's its own story within the same world. But again, I feel like that's easily remedied by just saying Six of Crows Book 1 / Grishaverse, something like that. Same with King of Scars. King of Scars, I actually do think King of Scars and Rule of Wolves are a duology that chronologically take place both after Grisha original trilogy, which I think at this point is called Shadow and Bone trilogy, and the Six of Crows duology. Then you get King of Scars and Rule of Wolves. That does require you to read pretty much the events of all of these other books, because there are characters from these that appear in that, and you will absolutely be spoiled. So you would want people to know. I think that there's a part of me that's like, I kind of feel like people know when they pick up Rule of Wolves that it's part of the same world. And I do wonder if that one is a little more upfront about it. But there are some, like with the example that launched this whole discussion, Air in particular, didn't really indicate super clearly that it was a part of the same thing. And then to have within the first couple of chapters spoilers for the arcs of the characters from the original series, I feel that's a little irresponsible of the publisher. I do recognize likely where the mindset comes from. I think it's twofold. One, I assume there is a monetary reason why you wouldn't want to list something like Air as being even within the same world, but also you wouldn't necessarily want to categorize it as an Ember in the Ashes book 5, because it's, first off, it's not an Ember in the Ashes book 5, it's its own story. But I do think by indicating it's within the same world, some readers will just automatically be like, oh, well, I haven't read the original quartet of that world, so I don't want to pick this up. Even though maybe they would have purchased Air and read it, and they wouldn't even know anything about what they're being spoiled about because they haven't read the original, they're not that familiar with it. I think it's a money thing. If you tell people something exists within the same world, they're less likely to pick it up because they're going to want to read the original work. So I think that's part of it. And then second, I also think that this is one that I understand a little bit more. I do recognize, and I kind of was just saying this within the first example, that some works really are super separate. I think Six of Crows and Shadow and Bone is a good example. They're quite separate from each other. So I recognize that calling that book 4 is not only not accurate, but you actually can read Six of Crows regardless of whether you've read Grisha, Shadow and Bone. I should be better about that, sorry. Regardless of whether you've read Shadow and Bone, you can read Six of Crows. In fact, a lot of people do, and some people even recommend it. So I do feel like there are reasons, and even if you said with returning characters from, that's, I think, all I want. I know that maybe the whole naming the book in the series / the world would be a little too much text, or maybe some people would get more confused by that, but I think if you just said with characters with returning characters from this series, you're not spoiling what's going to happen in this new series, and you're also not giving away what happens in the original. You're just like, they're connected, and then that's that. And also, I mean, I know something like Threads of Power by V.E. Schwab. V.E. Schwab did say you could start, she herself said you could start with Threads of Power, and I found for myself and a lot of other readers, I can't speak for everyone who's read it, but many of us were like, no, don't start with Threads of Power. I mean, I guess you can, but Threads of Power is one of the most interconnected in that even though you have a new character introduced, you have a few new things introduced, it doesn't take place that long after the events of the original Shades of Magic trilogy, and the characters from Shades of Magic are not only making appearances, they're kind of the main cast again, and I think that's similar to something like Red Rising. You do see a lot of your same characters. You get more new characters, though, in Iron Gold, the continuation of Red Rising, than you do with Shades of Magic. So I really feel like Threads of Power Book 1 / Shades of Magic Book 4, I feel like that's fair. I don't think it's that complicated. I don't know. Am I being overly picky? I do want to note that I asked all of you on both Instagram and on my community tab your thoughts on this. So even though I'm kind of asking a rhetorical question at this point of like, am I crazy for thinking that this is a simple fix? I don't think I am, because it seems a lot of you agree. So the way I worded it on the community tab post is, curious your thoughts on this. Should continuation books and series explicitly state in their synopses that they are continuations? 85% of you said yes, 3% said no, and I did have an option that said only if the book contains spoilers for the original book or series. 12% of you answered that option, and then Instagram had really similar results. 77% said yes, 2% said no, and only if it has spoilers was 21%. So a little bit more for the only if it has spoilers option, but in general, very few people were like, no, it shouldn't tell you at all. So I do think that that's interesting. Now, getting into the, and again, I take full accountability for the fact that I worded it in a way that made it sound like by saying continuation, I was just referring to like a continuation of the series, not a full-on, like there's an original work and then there's a new work. So I recognize why some people would have thought I was specifically talking about just books in series. So one person, and it's one of the top comments, I think this captures a lot of that idea, said, I don't know if it should be in the synopsis, but on the exterior it should explicitly be clear that it's number X in a series. So in this example of something being within the same series, not necessarily continuation in the way I was referring to, but it's just within the series. Let's say it's a trilogy, book 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I don't know why it's so difficult. This is a very long-lasting, gripe I think a lot of us have, which is like, why is it so difficult to put what number in the series it is? This, I think, is especially notable for series that are more than just a trilogy and that are really long. I know for myself that if there's a series I'm interested in, and it's maybe kind of hard to find books in that series, if I go to one of my local bookstores that has used books and I find entries into that series for really cheap, there's a part of me that's like, oh, did I find the first book? And then I'll look and I'm like, I can't tell. I don't know what it is. And sometimes my Wi-Fi is not very good in the used bookstores. And if they just had like a 1 on the spine, or if you opened it and it said book 1 or something like that, that definitely would be helpful. This is an easier fix than the conversation we were having about true continuation series. I think with just sequels, I don't understand. I kind of get it if it was originally a standalone and the author maybe always wanted to write it as a series, but they kind of had to write the first book where it could stand on its own. And the publisher was thinking, like, you're a little bit green, you don't have a lot of experience, so let's see how sales do with book 1, and then we'll decide later if we commit to publishing a whole series. That happens all the time. And I think in that example, it would make sense that you wouldn't label it as book 1 because you don't know if there are going to be more books. So you kind of want to leave it where people have the idea that it's just there in existence, but maybe there will be something else. You know, I understand that mindset. But once you do start having more books in the series, just open it and the title page says book 2 or something like that. I don't feel like this is very complicated. Anyway, that's it for a little bit of a rant. Thank you for those of you who answered within the poll. I feel like, again, I know I'm kind of repeating myself. I feel like this is a very simple fix, right? Anyway, if you'd like to contribute to the conversation or add any additional points that maybe I either glossed over or didn't mention at all, feel free to say that in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Wow, what? I don't know what I was just saying. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.